I'm Audrey, 35, female. I live in a quiet, older neighborhood in a small city, in a modest bungalow I was proud to buy with my own savings. As a research librarian, my life revolves around facts, order, and the quiet satisfaction of finding exactly what I'm looking for. I never imagined that my professional skills would become my greatest weapon in a war over 3 inches of dirt. This is the story of how my neighbor, a woman who weaponized entitlement, illegally moved our property line while I was on vacation, and how I used a forgotten city ordinance to give her exactly what she deserved. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Buying my first home was the culmination of years of disciplined saving and dreaming. The house itself wasn't grand, a 2-bedroom, 1950s brick bungalow with good bones and a desperate need for some cosmetic love. Its best feature, in my opinion, was the backyard. It was a perfect rectangle of green, bordered by old, sturdy fencing on 2 sides and a dilapidated, leaning fence on the third, the one I shared with the house to my right. It was a blank canvas, and I had visions of lush garden beds, a small patio for reading, and a haven of peace. I closed on the house in early spring and spent the first few months painting, refinishing floors, and feeling the deep, abiding joy of creating a space that was entirely mine. Then, in late May, Brenda and Gary moved in next door. My first interaction with Brenda should have been a red flag the size of a city bus. I was in my front yard, wrestling a particularly stubborn patch of weeds from a flower bed, when she marched across her newly manicured lawn. She was a woman who seemed perpetually braced for a confrontation, with a sharp, angular haircut and eyes that scanned for imperfections. "You're the new owner," she stated, not asked. She didn't introduce herself. "I am," I said, standing up and wiping my sweaty hands on my jeans. "I'm Audrey, nice to meet you." I offered a hand, which she ignored. "Brenda," she said, her eyes flicking from my face to the weeds in my hand, then to the slightly peeling paint on my front porch railing. "I'm a lifestyle consultant. I help people optimize their living spaces for maximum value and aesthetic harmony." "Oh, that's interesting," I replied, unsure what else to say. "Your porch needs work," she said, her tone dripping with unsolicited advice. "And that color," she gestured to my front door, which I had just painted a cheerful shade of teal, "is not compliant with the neighborhood's unofficial palette. It brings down the tone of the block." I blinked, the unofficial palette. "The more discerning homeowners have an understanding," she said coolly. "Neutrals, earth tones, nothing so loud." I was floored by the audacity. This wasn't an HOA community. It was a quiet, unpretentious neighborhood of middle-class families and retirees. My other neighbors had waved, introduced themselves, and one had even brought over a plate of cookies. Brenda, however, had opened with a critique of my front door. "Well," I said, forcing a polite smile, "I quite like it. It makes me happy." Brenda's lips thinned into a razor-straight line. "Happiness is fleeting. Property value is an investment." She turned on her heel and marched back to her own property, leaving me standing in a cloud of bewildered indignation. That was Brenda in a nutshell, a walking, talking embodiment of unsolicited judgment. Her husband, Gary, was a shadow. A perpetually harried-looking man who worked in middle management somewhere, and whose main role seemed to be nodding in agreement with his wife and scurrying to fulfill her commands. I'd see him power washing their driveway at dusk or meticulously edging the lawn under Brenda's hawk-eyed supervision from the porch. Over the next year, the interactions accumulated, each one a small paper cut of passive aggression. There were the anonymous notes left on my car windshield about parking too close to the invisible line dividing our driveways. There were the loud, pointed conversations she'd have with Gary in their backyard about people who don't properly fertilize their lawns, her voice carrying clear over the fence. She'd complain if my sprinkler spray dared to miss a single blade of her grass. She once called the non-emergency police line because my visiting friend's car was parked on the street in front of her house for 2 hours. The officer who showed up looked deeply apologetic. Her obsession, her magnum opus, was her garden. It was a testament to meticulous, almost fanatical control. Perfectly spaced tulips in the spring, prize-winning roses in the summer, symmetrical mums in the fall. Every leaf was glossy, every petal unblemished. She treated her garden like a high-stakes competition, and the dilapida Ted fence that separated her perfect floral kingdom from my humble, work-in-progress yard was a source of constant irritation for her. "That fence is an eyesore, Audrey," she'd say, catching me as I brought in my groceries. "It's a blight. When are you planning to do something about it?" "It's a shared fence, Brenda," I'd remind her, my voice weary. "We need to agree on a replacement and split the cost." At this, she would scoff. "Why should I pay for your neglect? It was fine before you moved in." This was a blatant lie. Liam, the young web developer who lived on the other side of me, had told me the fence had been leaning for at least a decade. I wanted a new fence, but I didn't have the several $1,000s for a project of that scale just yet. My priority had been fixing a leaky roof and updating the ancient electrical panel. The fence was on the list, but it was not at the top. I told her as much, explaining that I was saving up and hoped to replace it the following year. This was not the answer she wanted. Her frustration simmered, palpable every time she was in her yard. I could feel her staring at the fence, at my yard, her disapproval of physical force. Still, I believed it was a problem that could be managed. I believed in property lines, in decency, in the basic tenets of neighborly conduct. I would soon learn, painfully naive. The battle lines were being drawn, and I was about to be flanked. My mistake was thinking the war would be fought with passive-aggressive comments. I had no idea it was about to escalate into a full-blown invasion. After 2 years of hard work and saving, I was finally ready for a real vacation. Not just a long weekend, but a proper 2-week unplug-and recharge trip. I'd booked a flight to a quiet coastal town in a different time zone, a place with beaches, hiking trails, and most importantly, no neighbors. I arranged for Liam, my friendly neighbor on the other side, to collect my mail and keep an eye on the place. I packed my bags, watered my plants, and left with a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. I was blissfully unaware that back home, my neighbor was plotting a land grab of comically small, yet deeply infuriating proportions. The first week of my vacation was idyllic. I hiked, I swam, I read 3 novels. I barely looked at my phone. The quiet was profound. The only person I heard from was my mother, who called to check in. It was a perfect escape. The peace was first punctured by a text message from Brenda at the beginning of my second week away. "Audrey, hope you're having a good trip," it began, the pleasantry feeling thin and insincere even in text form. "Gary and I have decided we simply cannot look at that dreadful fence for another season. We've hired a crew to take it down. Don't worry, we will handle the disposal." My stomach tightened. I was thousands of miles away. "Brenda," I typed back immediately, my thumbs fumbling on the screen. "We need to discuss this. A new fence needs to be agreed upon by both of us. We have to decide on a style and cost." Her reply was almost instantaneous. "No need to worry your head about it on your vacation. We have it under control. We've chosen a lovely white vinyl privacy fence. It will be a massive improvement for the entire neighborhood." My heart started to pound. A white vinyl fence. The kind her entire house was trimmed in. It was the exact opposite of the natural wood fence I had wanted to eventually install, the kind that would blend in with a garden, not stick out like a sore thumb. "Brenda, I don't want a vinyl fence," I wrote, my tone becoming more forceful. "And we need to discuss the cost sharing. We also need to ensure it's installed on the exact property line." "It's really for the best," her reply came, a dismissive pat on the head. "You'll see when you get back. Just relax and enjoy your time off." The smiley face felt like a dagger. It was the official punctuation of condescension. She was doing this without my consent, steamrolling me from afar. I felt a surge of helpless anger. What could I do? I was on a beach on the other side of the country. I called her, but it went straight to voicemail. I sent another, more strongly worded text. Do not proceed with any installation until I am back and we have had a formal discussion and signed an agreement. This is a shared property line. I received no reply. For the rest of the day, a knot of anxiety sat in my gut. I tried to enjoy my last few days off, but a shadow had been cast. I felt powerless, managed, and deeply disrespected. It was the ultimate power play, to make a permanent, costly change to my property while I was physically unable to stop it. I imagined her smug satisfaction, directing the work crew, Gary scurrying behind her with a level and a tape measure. The thought made my blood boil. I texted Liam, asking if he'd seen any activity. Yeah, weird stuff, he replied a few hours later. A crew was there yesterday. I tore down the old fence. Now they're putting up a new one. It's that bright white plastic kind. Looks like they're just about done. So she had ignored my explicit instructions. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about a fundamental violation of boundaries and respect. She had waited until I was gone, unable to object, and then acted unilaterally, imposing her will on my home. The rest of my vacation was ruined. Every time I looked at the ocean, I pictured that sterile, white plastic fence. I pictured Brenda's triumphant smirk. I felt like a fool for having been so trusting, for believing that basic neighborly etiquette would prevail. I cut my trip short by a day, catching a red-eye flight that would get me home in the morning. I needed to see the damage for myself. I needed to confront this head-on. As the plane descended toward my home city, I wasn't filled with the usual post-vacation melancholy. I was filled with a cold, simmering rage. The battle had been initiated in my absence, but the war was far from over. I arrived home exhausted, bleary-eyed from the overnight flight, and filled with a sense of dread. I pulled my car into the driveway and just sat there for a full minute, staring. The fence was jarring. It was a brilliant, sterile white wall, 6 feet high, gleaming in the morning sun. It looked completely out of place next to my modest brick bungalow, like a set of brand-new dentures in an antique jewelry box. It was exactly as ugly as I had imagined, but something else was wrong. It felt closer. I got out of the car, my suitcase still in the trunk, and walked towards it. The fence line didn't look right. My small Japanese maple tree, which had previously stood a good foot away from the old, leaning fence, now seemed to be practically touching the new vinyl panels. My perennial bed, which I had carefully designed with a comfortable walking path between the plants and the fence, was now cramped. The path was gone. The back row of my hostas was crushed against the white vinyl base. My brain struggled to process it. It was a trick of the eye, surely. A result of the new fence being perfectly straight while the old one had been warped and bowed, but the feeling persisted. A cold, sinking suspicion began to form in the pit of my stomach. I walked the length of the fence from the sidewalk to the back of my property. The entire line felt shifted. It was subtle, a matter of inches, not feet, but it was my yard. I knew its dimensions intimately. I knew the feel of the space. And this was different. This was smaller. Just then, Brenda's back door slid open, and she emerged, holding a mug of coffee. She had the air of a monarch surveying her newly conquered territory. "Audrey, you're back a day early," she called out, a saccharine-sweet smile plastered on her face. "What do you think? Isn't it a tremendous improvement?" I turned to face her, my expression grim. "Brenda, the fence looks closer." She let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like cracking ice. "Oh, don't be silly. That's just because it's straight now. Your old fence was practically falling into my yard. We put it exactly where the old one was. Gary was very precise." "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It's not right. My hostas are crushed. My tree is right up against it." "Well, perhaps your plants were encroaching on my property," she countered, her smile tightening. "This is the proper boundary. You're just not used to seeing a clean line." This was the beginning of the Gaslight Grand Prix, and Brenda was aiming for a podium finish. She treated my concerns as if I were a hysterical child, incapable of understanding basic geometry. For the next 20 minutes, she stood on her side of the gleaming white wall and systematically dismantled my reality. My husband used a string line, Audrey. A string line, she said, as if this were a tool of unimpeachable scientific accuracy. He measured from both ends. It's perfectly placed. You're just imagining things because you're tired from your trip. I'm not imagining the fact that there used to be a path here, and now there isn't, I shot back, my voice rising. That path was on my property, she insisted, her voice taking on a wounded tone. I've been very patient for years with your overgrown weeds and leaning fence. I finally took the initiative to improve the neighborhood, and this is the thanks I get? Accusations. It was a masterful performance. She was the benevolent benefactor, the put-upon victim of my ingratitude. I was the crazy, ungrateful neighbor who couldn't see the gift that had been bestowed upon me. Gary appeared behind her, nodding dumbly. It's straight as an arrow, Audrey, he offered meekly. Measured it myself. I felt like I was losing my mind. They were a united front of absolute denial. They presented their fiction with such unwavering confidence that it was designed to make me doubt my own senses. But I knew my yard. I knew where my plants were. And I knew that this woman had not only disregarded my explicit instructions, but had also stolen a sliver of my property. 3 inches, maybe 4. It was a tiny amount of land, meaningless in the grand scheme of things. But it was mine. And the sheer, unmitigated gall of it, to steal it and then lie to my face with a sweet smile, ignited a fire within me. I'll be getting a professional survey, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Brenda's smile finally vanished, replaced by a flash of fury. Don't you dare threaten me. You'll be wasting your money. The fence is in the right place. She turned and herded Gary back inside, sliding the door shut with a sharp thud. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest. The fight was over for now, but the war had been declared. She thought she could win by sheer force of will, by being the loudest and most confident liar in the room. She was a lifestyle consultant, but I was a research librarian, and I was about to go to work. The next morning, the gaslighting hangover had been replaced by a cold, clear resolve. Brenda's strategy was to create a reality distortion fueled through sheer audacity. My strategy would be to arm myself with something she couldn't argue with, indisputable, documented facts. My career as a research librarian had prepared me for this exact moment. I wasn't just a keeper of books, I was a hunter of information, skilled in navigating labyrinthine databases, dusty archives, and bureaucratic red tape. This was not a spat over a fence. It was a research project with the highest possible stakes, my own peace of mind. My first step was to establish a baseline. I went to the City Hall's records department, a place I knew well from my work. I requested the original plat map for our subdivision, filed in 1952. The clerk, a woman I knew from interlibrary meetings, handed me a large, fragile sheet of paper. There, in precise, faded ink, were the dimensions of every lot on our block. I took a high-resolution photo of the document with my phone, focusing on the section showing my lot and Brenda's. It clearly stated my property had a width of 50 feet. Next, I needed to prove the current state of affairs. This required a professional. I searched for the most reputable land surveying companies in the city and settled on one run by a woman named Ms. Evans who had over 30 years of experience. I called and explained the situation. Her voice on the phone was calm and professional. A boundary dispute with a new fence? Oh, honey, that's the bread and butter of this business, she said with a dry chuckle. I can have a team out there tomorrow morning. The next day, 2 surveyors arrived with their tripods, electronic distance meters, and a look of grim professionalism. Brenda and Gary immediately came out onto their porch to watch, arms crossed, their faces masks of indignation. They glared as the surveyors drove metal pins into the ground, took measurements, and made notes on a tablet. The process took about 2 hours. At the end, the lead surveyor came to my door. Well, he said, pulling off his cap and wiping his brow, your neighbor is not going to be happy. He showed me the preliminary results on his tablet. The new fence was, in fact, encroaching on my property. It wasn't a uniform amount. It started at about 1 inch at the front and widened to nearly 4 inches at the very back of the yard. Brenda hadn't just moved the fence. She had angled it to capture a larger slice of the more private, rear part of the yard. The average encroachment was 3 inches. "She stole a wedge of my yard," I breathed, a strange mix of vindicated and furious. "That she did," he confirmed. "Ms. Evans will have the official, certified survey map drawn up and sent to you by the end of the week. It'll be legally binding and admissible in court." I paid them, my hand shaking slightly as I signed the invoice. It was a significant expense, but the validation was priceless. I had my proof. The certified map arrived 3 days later, a beautiful, crisp document with bold lines and official seals. It was a weapon. My first instinct was to march over, wave the map in Brenda's face, and demand she move the fence. But I knew that would just lead to more screaming and denial. A direct confrontation with an unreasonable person is a losing game. I needed a better strategy. I needed leverage. I needed a plan that didn't rely on her cooperation at all. This is where the librarian's gambit truly began. I took the survey and my copy of the original plat map and started digging into the city's municipal code. I didn't just search for fences or property lines. I went deeper. I spent hours in the online legal archives, cross-referencing zoning laws, building codes, and property ordinances. I read through decades of amendments, looking for loopholes, forgotten rules, anything that could give me an edge. For 2 evenings, I found nothing but standard regulations. But on the third night, deep in a subsection of the city planning code titled Urban Easements and Setbacks, I found it. It was a single paragraph in an ordinance from 1978, an amendment passed to deal with drainage issues in older neighborhoods. It was obscure, written in dense legalese, and likely forgotten by almost everyone. The ordinance stated that for any new fence or permanent structure erected along a shared property line where no formal drainage easement exists, the structure must be built with a mandatory maintenance setback of exactly 24 inches from the legally surveyed property line. The purpose was to allow either homeowner access to maintain their side of the fence without trespassing. The key phrase was mandatory setback. It wasn't a suggestion, it was the law. And crucially, it applied to new fences. My old, dilapidated fence had been grandfathered in. Brenda's brand new, gleaming white vinyl fence was not. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was the checkmate move. Brenda hadn't just built her fence 3 inches onto my property. By building it on the line, or what she thought was the line, she had violated this ordinance. To be legally compliant, her new fence needed to be not on the property line, but a full 2 feet inside her yard. My plan began to form, sharp and brilliant in my mind. I wouldn't ask her to move the fence back 3 inches. I would legally compel her to move it back 27 inches, the 3 she stole, plus the 24 required by the ordinance. This wouldn't just restore my property. It would decimate the prize-winning garden border she cherished so much. Her perfectly spaced roses, her symmetrical lilies, the entire manicured edge she lorded over the neighborhood. All of it was planted in the 2-foot zone that was about to become a legally mandated access path. I printed the ordinance. I printed the certified survey. I placed them side by side on my coffee table. The gaslighting was over. The game had changed. Brenda thought she was playing checkers, making simple, aggressive moves. She was about to find out I was playing chess. With my arsenal of documents, the certified survey and the obscure city ordinance, I felt a surge of power. This was no longer about my feelings versus Brenda's lies. This was about the law. But a plan is only as good as its execution. I spent the next week meticulously laying the groundwork for what I now thought of as Operation Savage Compliance. My first step was to create an unimpeachable paper trail. I wasn't going to engage in another screaming match across the lawn. This would be handled formally, officially, and with cold, hard professionalism. I drafted a letter. It was polite, detached, and utterly ruthless. The letter began by stating the facts. Following the recent installation of a new fence at your property, I commissioned a certified land survey to verify the boundary line we share. I attached a copy of Ms. Evans's survey map, with the area of encroachment highlighted in yellow. As you can see, the letter continued, the survey confirms that the new fence encroaches upon my property, lot number 24, by a margin of 1 to 4 inches. Then came the masterstroke. Furthermore, I wrote, my research into the city's municipal code has brought to my attention Ordinance 7814B, concerning setbacks for new boundary structures. I quoted the entire paragraph verbatim and attached a printed copy of the ordinance itself. According to this ordinance, your new fence is in violation of the mandatory 24-inch maintenance setback from the legal property line. To bring the structure into compliance, it must be relocated to a position no less than 24 inches inside your property boundary. I concluded the letter with a clear, non-negotiable call to action. You have 30 days from the date of this letter to remove the current fence and reinstall it in a legally compliant position. If the fence is not moved within this timeframe, I will pursue all available legal options to enforce the city code, including filing a formal complaint with the Department of City Planning and seeking legal action to compel the fence's removal at your expense. I sent the letter via certified mail with a signature required. This was crucial. There would be no claiming she never got it. The green receipt card would be my proof. 2 days later, the mail carrier handed me the signed receipt. Brenda had it. The clock was ticking. For the next few days, an eerie silence descended. I saw her car in the driveway, but I didn't see her. No notes, no angry voicemails, no marching across the lawn. It was the quiet before the storm. I knew she was stewing. She was likely trying to find a way to discredit me, to poke holes in my research. I imagined her on the phone, trying to bully some poor clerk at City Hall. But my facts were solid. On day 5, the silence broke. It wasn't a confrontation, it was an escalation. I came home from work to find a letter from a law firm in my mailbox. It was a classic cease and desist, filled with blustering legal jargon. It accused me of a campaign of harassment against their client, Brenda. It called my survey dubious and my interpretation of the ordinance unfounded and self-serving. It demanded I cease all communication with their client and threatened a countersuit for emotional distress. They were trying to intimidate me. They thought a letter from a lawyer would make me back down. It had the opposite effect. It told me they were scared. Brenda had lawyered up, which meant she knew I was right. I smiled. This was just another piece of the puzzle. My next step was to contact the city directly. I didn't file a complaint yet. That was my ace in the hole. Instead, I submitted a request for clarification to the Department of City Planning. I laid out the situation hypothetically, without using names or addresses. If a new fence is built on a property line, and a survey shows it encroaches, and Ordinance 7814B requires a 24-inch setback, what is the city's enforcement protocol? An email came back from a senior zoning administrator 2 days later. It was everything I had hoped for. The ordinance is clear, he wrote. The structure would be in violation. The homeowner would be required to move it to a compliant position. Failure to comply after notification would result in daily fines and, eventually, a city-ordered removal at the owner's expense. I now had confirmation from the city itself. My blueprints for Bedlam were complete. I had the survey, the ordinance, the proof of notification, the threatening letter from her lawyer, which proved she was aware of the dispute, and now an official clarification from the city. I waited. The 30-day deadline I had set was approaching. I saw Gary in their yard one weekend, frantically measuring the distance from the fence to his prized rose bushes. The look on his face was one of pure panic. They knew exactly what was at stake. Their garden, Brenda's source of pride and joy, her symbol of neighborhood dominance, was sitting on death row, and I was the one holding the pardon. But I had no intention of granting it. They had chosen their path when they decided to steal from me and lie about it. Now, they were going to walk it to its bitter, inevitable end. The deadline was 2 days away. The storm was about to break. On the 31st day, with no sign of compliance from Brenda and Gary, I moved to the final phase of my plan. I woke up early, a strange sense of calm washing over me. Today was the day the talking stopped. I took my entire file of evidence, the certified letter receipt, the survey, the ordinance, my correspondence with the city, and the letter from Brenda's lawyer, and drove to the Department of City Planning. I filed a formal complaint. The official who reviewed my file was the same senior administrator I had emailed. He read through everything, his expression growing more serious with each page. He looked up at me. "Ms. Audrey," he said, "you have built an ironclad case. This is one of the most well-documented citizen complaints I have ever seen." He stamped my complaint as officially received and told me a compliance officer would be sent to the property within 48 hours to issue a formal notice of violation. The notice was posted on Brenda's front door the very next day. It was a large, bright orange sticker, impossible to miss. It officially ordered them to move the fence to a compliant position within 14 days or face a fine of $200 per day. This is when the meltdown began. That evening, Brenda appeared at my front door, her face blotchy and contorted with rage. She hammered on the door with her fist. I didn't answer. I just watched her through the peephole. She was screaming, her voice a shrill torrent of insults and threats. She called me a psycho, a freak, a lonely old librarian with nothing better to do. She shrieked about her lawyer, about suing me into oblivion. Gary hovered behind her on the lawn, wringing his hands, looking terrified. Liam, my tech-savvy neighbor, was filming the entire tirade from his window. After 10 minutes of her unhinged screaming, I calmly called the non-emergency police line, just as she had done to my friend. I reported a disturbance and a neighbor harassing me at my home. When the police cruiser pulled up, Brenda's tirade screeched to a halt. The change was instantaneous. She morphed into the victim, tears welling in her eyes. "Officer, thank goodness," she cried. "This woman has been stalking and harassing me for weeks. Now she's making false reports about me." The officer listened patiently, then turned to me as I opened the door. "Ma'am, what's your side of the story?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply said, "This is a civil property dispute that is being handled by the city. My neighbor received a notice of violati on today and is unhappy about it. She was screaming and pounding on my door. I have it all on my security camera." I pointed to the small camera I'd installed above my door after the fence incident. The officer looked from my calm demeanor to Brenda's theatrical sobbing. He then looked at the big orange violation notice still stuck to her door. His expression said it all. "Ma'am," he said to Brenda, his voice firm, "this is a civil matter. You need to take it up with the city. Do not come back to this resident's property, or you will be charged with harassment." He sent her away, defeated and fuming. The 14-day deadline passed. The fence didn't move. The fines began to accumulate. After another week, a second, more severe notice was issued. They now had 7 days to comply, or the city would hire its own contractor to remove the fence, and a lien would be placed on their property for the cost of the removal, the new installation, and all accrued fines. This finally broke them. The day before the final deadline, a fencing crew, a different one this time, showed up at Brenda's house. But they weren't there to install a fence. They were there to move one. I sat on my back patio with a glass of iced tea and watched the show. It was a slow, agonizing process. They had to dig up every single post. And to do so, they had to dismantle Brenda's garden. Her prize-winning roses were uprooted and tossed aside. Her perfect rows of lilies were trampled. The lush green sod she had installed was peeled back, revealing bare, ugly dirt. Brenda stood on her deck, her body rigid with a silent, helpless fury. She didn't scream or cry. She just watched, her face a pale, tight mask of hate as her beautiful, manicured border, her kingdom, was systematically destroyed. The crew worked methodically, first removing the fence entirely, then digging a new trench 27 inches back from where the fence had been, entirely on her property. The most satisfying moment came when they remeasured the property line, using my survey markers as their guide. They hammered a stake deep into the ground right where my crushed hostas had been. My 3 inches were restored. But now, I also had a new 2-foot-wide corridor of barren dirt on her side of the line. By the end of the day, the gleaming white fence was back up, but it was a monument to her defeat. It looked ridiculous, marooned in the middle of what used to be her garden, with a huge, ugly scar of mud and debris running along its length. My yard, by contrast, now felt spacious and open. My little Japanese maple had room to breathe. The day of reckoning was over. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't resorted to insults. I had simply used the truth, a tool far more powerful and destructive than any tantrum she could ever throw. The aftermath was quieter than I expected, but infinitely more satisfying. Brenda and Gary became ghosts in their own home. The vibrant, arrogant energy that had once radiated from their property was gone, replaced by a sullen, defeated silence. The front of their house remained immaculate, a desperate attempt to project the image of perfection. But the backyard, visible from my kitchen window, told the real story. The 2-foot-wide strip of land along the fence, the former site of Brenda's glorious garden, remained a scar of bare earth. It was her walk of shame, a daily reminder of her spectacular failure. She made no attempt to replant it. The rage and meticulous energy she had once poured into her roses had curdled into apathy. Weeds began to sprout in the barren soil, a final insult from nature itself. The rest of her garden, now disconnected from the fence line, looked forlorn and incomplete. Her reign as the neighborhood's self-appointed queen was over. Liam told me that she had tried to spin the story to other neighbors, painting me as a vindictive monster who had exploited a legal loophole to destroy her property. But her credibility was shot. Her public meltdown, which Liam had gleefully shared with a few trusted neighbors, combined with the very visible evidence of the city's violation notice, meant that no one bought her story. They had all been on the receiving end of her petty tyrannies for years, and they knew exactly who she was. For the first time, there was a sense of solidarity on the block, a collective sigh of relief. A month after the fence was moved, I received a check in the mail from Brenda's lawyer. It was for the full cost of my land survey, with no letter or explanation enclosed. It was a white flag, a tacit admission of defeat. I cashed it without a second thought. The real victory, however, wasn't the money or the reclaimed 3 inches of land. It was the silence. It was the ability to walk in my own backyard without feeling watched or judged. It was the profound peace of knowing that I had stood up to a bully not by stooping to her level, but by rising above it with intelligence and strategy. With the dispute settled, I finally earned my attention to my side of the fence. I had never wanted a white vinyl fence, but now it was a symbol of my victory. I decided to embrace it. I planted fast-growing, flowering vines, clematis and jasmine, at its base. I built a beautiful new stone patio, reclaimed the walking path next to my perennial beds, and my Japanese maple, now free from encroachment, flourished. My yard became the peaceful haven I had always dreamed it would be. The vines slowly began to climb the sterile white panels, softening the harshness with blossoms and greenery. From my side, the fence was becoming a living wall of beauty. From her side, it remained a stark white monument to her own folly, casting a long shadow over her garden of karma, a garden sown with arrogance, watered with deceit, and now left to rot in the weeds. I never spoke to Brenda or Gary again. We coexisted as strangers, separated by a fence that stood not on a line between properties, but on the chasm between right and wrong. And on my side of that line, life was very, very good.